Flaxborough, in its most honest moments, liked to think of itself as a town secured by custom rather than by locks. Doors were seldom bolted before midnight, bicycles leaned with hopeful optimism against low fences, and the garden gates of respectable properties were expected, like prayers in church, to behave themselves without supervision. This was why the gate at Alderney House caused such a disturbance. It was not at first a police matter. It was a matter of affront. Mildred Hapscombe, who had observed the habits of the town with an attention bordering on vocational devotion, first noted the impropriety at precisely 8:45 in the morning, just after she had watered her exterior geraniums and before she had moved on to the internal ferns. "The gate is open," she said aloud, to no one in particular. She said it not as a statement of fact, but as an accusation directed at the very fabric of public order. Alderney House belonged to Mr. Tobias Morningside, a man who believed devoutly in hinges, latches, and the moral strength of well-oiled brass. His gate had not stood open unintentionally in the last 17 years, a record that had been privately admired by more people than one might imagine. Yet there it stood, yawning slightly, as though it had developed a private opinion and decided at last to express it. By 10 o'clock, the matter had reached the butcher. By 10:30, it had reached the post office. By noon, it had acquired motive. There were, as always, competing explanations. Some thought it was vandalism, though Flaxborough's record for criminal vandalism consisted mainly of a chalk moustache once added to a war memorial statue, and even that was believed to have been done in a spirit of harmless experimentation. Others believed it was neglect, which was far more serious. In due course, the business reached the desk of Inspector Purbright, though not, as might be imagined, in the form of a formal report. It came instead in the form of a complaint by Councillor Percy Bottle, who had come to see a man about a pothole, and, failing to feel fully heard, had chosen to remark upon the gate instead. "You can tell a town's going to pieces," said Councillor Bottle, with a professional air of doom, "when respectable hinges start losing their grip on things." Inspector Purbright, who had been quietly coaxing a reluctant typewriter into something resembling obedience, allowed the comment to settle. He did not at once stand. He did not reach for his hat. He merely observed, "It may be, sir, that the gate wished to let something out rather than something in." This was not, as Councillor Bottle supposed, a joke. It was an observation. By mid-afternoon, Purbright walked to Alderney House in the company of Sergeant Lovegrove, who had once expressed the belief that gates ought to be locked by law, and that geraniums were probably complicit in most modern disorders. The garden itself showed no sign of disturbance. The gravel had been swept with the piety of a cathedral floor. The roses, though ambitious, had not strayed beyond their moral boundaries. Only the gate itself behaved oddly. It did not swing fully open, nor did it rest properly shut. It hovered, hesitating, like a man who has remembered something important halfway down the street. "Faulty latch," declared Lovegrove with official satisfaction. "Possibly," said Purbright, who crouched slightly, though not so much as to be mistaken for a man who crouched habitually. He noticed 3 things. First, the latch was recently polished. Second, the hinge, though old, had not been forced. Third, and most quietly instructive, the gate opened inward. Someone, therefore, had been leaving rather than arriving. Mr. Morningside himself emerged from the house carefully, carrying indignation in a teacup. "I cannot think," he said, "what the town is coming to. One does not fasten things merely for decoration." Purbright smiled with a patience that had been slow-cooked over many years of small disappointments. "Did you open it yourself, sir?" Certainly not. Did you hear it moved? No. Did you check it before retiring? Of course, one does. This was, in Flaxborough logic, irrefutable, and yet the gate stood open. That evening, in houses full of net curtains and modest suspicions, the incident grew. By nightfall it had become not a loose gate, but a message. The gate, according to popular imagination, had been opened deliberately. By whom remained a social question of some delicacy. Inspector Purbright, returning to his office, made only a single note. "Gate not broken. Gate permitted." He sat quietly for some time afterwards, considering what sort of thing wished to leave a garden without troubling any hinges. And elsewhere in the town, unseen and quietly satisfied, someone else hoped very much the gate would be blamed. By the following morning, the open gate at Alderney House had acquired a second life, which was to say a more respectable one. It was no longer merely a matter of faulty hardware or private inconvenience. It had become a subject suitable for murmured discussion behind gloved hands, for lowered voices at counters, and for that particular tightening of lips which signified a community's determination to feel concerned without appearing foolish. Mildred Hapscombe found herself in considerable demand. People did not ask her questions directly. That would have been vulgar. They simply arranged themselves by coincidence at her elbow and made statements of such delicate vagueness that she was morally obliged to improve upon them. "Strange, isn't it?" said Mrs. Dawlish at the baker's, staring hard at a tray of custard tarts she had no intention of buying. "How things don't behave as they used to." "Very strange," agreed Mildred, who knew an invitation when she heard one. "I saw it with my own eyes." "Not broken, just undecided." "Ah," said Mrs. Dawlish, and the tone implied that undecided things were the beginning of moral collapse. At the post office, Mr. Simperley had his own theory, which he delivered to no one who had directly asked for it. "If you ask me," he said over the sound of leisurely stamped envelopes, "it's not about the gate at all. It's about what people think when they see it open." This was considered a subtle remark. Behind net curtains, small calculations were being made. If the gate had been opened from inside, and if Mr. Morningside was known to be a man of methodical habits, then either he had forgotten, which was unthinkable, or someone else had passed through. And if someone else had passed through, one naturally wondered who. Also, why. Inspector Purbright did not hurry. He never hurried, particularly when people were becoming interesting of their own accord. Instead, he returned to Alderney House at a time selected not by urgency, but by social rhythm, arriving just after the postman had left and just before the milk bottles were collected. He knew this was the time when doors were most likely to be left ajar, and tongues most likely to follow. Mr. Morningside received him in the front parlour, which smelled of beeswax polish and carefully unspoken disappointments. "It's hardly a crime," Mr. Morningside said, with a faint air of resentment that the matter was not, in fact, a murder. "No," Purbright agreed. "Crimes have a way of announcing themselves. This seems more conversational." Mr. Morningside gave a small sniff, which in Flaxborough passed for boldness. "I have lived here 30 years. "So people have told me, sir." "And never," said Mr. Morningside, "have I found that gate in a state of moral indecision." Purbright's eyes drifted gently and without apparent purpose to a small table by the window where a letter lay face down. The envelope bore no postmark. "Did you have visitors yesterday evening, sir?" "No." "Earlier in the day?" "No." "Visitors who did not announce themselves?" Purbright asked politely. "I should have heard them." "That is what one hopes." Outside, Sergeant Lovegrove shifted his weight from foot to foot and made a face at a cat that was staring at him with professional indifference. He did not like investigations with no obvious villain. He preferred his crimes to have a smell. Purbright, meanwhile, noticed what was not being said. Mr. Morningside did not speak of fear, he spoke of embarrassment. That afternoon the story took its next small, crooked step forward when Mrs. Elspeth Cranch appeared at the police station with a basket of scones and a burdened conscience. "I don't want to make trouble," she said, which in Flaxborough was usually the beginning of extensive trouble, "but people are talking." "They would," said Purbright gently. "It saves them the effort of thinking." She leaned forward, lowering her voice, though there was no one within 30 feet who had any interest in hearing something ordinary. "I was coming back from the church hall," she said, "about 7:30. I don't always take that way, but I did last night." "And," Purbright prompted, "and I saw someone by Mr. Morningside's gate." Lovegrove, who had learned to make encouraging noises, made one. "In the dark?" Purbright asked. "Yes." "Anyone you recognized?" She hesitated, which in itself was a form of recognition. "I thought it might be young Harold Pinter from the chemist's." Lovegrove perked up visibly. "Why?" "Well," she said carefully, "he was behaving in a way that suggested purpose." "Which was?" "He was standing very still." "Then he wasn't." This was noted. By evening, the chemist's assistant was already becoming the town's favourite theory. It was a comfortable idea. He was young, which suggested restlessness. He worked around bottles, which suggested temptation. Purbright, walking home, considered the mechanisms of reputation. A boy could be ruined before supper on the strength of a shadow and a woman's moral imagination. He passed the gate again. It was shut, not latched, just resting against its own conscience. He stood for a moment and looked at the newly polished latch, at the quiet hinge, at the gap where wood met post. Someone had touched it recently. Someone who cared how it looked. In a kitchen not far away, someone else listened to voices passing the window and felt both alarmed and curiously relieved. Blame, once it began to travel, was a thing that gathered speed without guidance. Purbright made another mental note, which he did not write down. The town was attempting to solve the matter in the only way it knew, by choosing a convenient person and wrapping him tightly in suspicion. He suspected the gate, meanwhile, was telling a rather different story. The chemist's assistant did not know he had become a theory. Harold Pinter continued to shelve cough mixtures and trace invoices in a careful, slanting hand, unaware that his name now travelled quietly from scullery to scullery, acquiring shape and motive as it went. In Flaxborough, a young man could be transformed into a menace by nothing more than a dim lantern and a tendency to stand still. Sergeant Lovegrove, who enjoyed theories in a practical way, was already warming to the idea by the time he and Purbright stood once more before the gate at Alderney House. "Fitz, sir," he said. "Young fellow, bit quiet. Always about with keys and bottles. Could have got curious." "Curiosity," said Purbright mildly, "is often accused when habit is more likely." "Gate was loose," Lovegrove insisted, kneeling with enthusiasm and applying a firm, unnecessary shake. "Look at it. Old wood, old iron. It'll be the hinge." The gate obligingly wobbled, though not enough to suggest violence. The hinge emitted a faint, dignified complaint, like an elderly relative disapproving of noise. "Broken hinge," Lovegrove concluded with relief. This was something he could report. Purbright did not contradict him. He simply observed the angle of the morning light against the polished latch, and the way the wood bore faint traces of recent handling. Fingers had been here, careful fingers, not young ones, not hurried ones. They went, as policemen must, to the chemist's shop. Harold Pinter, summoned from the back room, arrived with the earnest posture of a man who believed in innocence, but sensed it had a poor legal reputation. "You were near Alderney House last night?" Lovegrove asked him. "I took the long way home," Harold said. "Why?" "There are fewer dogs." This was, in Flaxborough, an entirely respectable reason. "Did you touch the gate?" Lovegrove pressed. Harold looked baffled, which was his natural and untutored state. "No, sir." Purbright watched his face as one might watch weather. There were small disturbances, no storms. "What did you see?" Purbright asked gently. "Nothing." "Did you hear anything?" "No." "Were you in a hurry?" Harold considered this. "I was thinking of my mother's rheumatism." Lovegrove blinked. "I thought you said you were in a hurry." "I wasn't," Harold said. "Not really." The theory suffered, but theories, once born, do not die easily in respectable towns. They merely thin slightly around the edges and wait for better lighting. By afternoon, the broken hinge had become official. The local paper, which had been rung by 3 people who did not wish to be named, and one who very much did, composed a small paragraph suggesting that age and weather were likely to blame for the incident. The word mischief appeared, which pleased everyone. Purbright, returning to Alderney House alone, found the latch newly polished again. He did not look surprised. Instead, he stood with the mild, unhurried air of a man admiring a well-behaved pony. Mr. Morningside joined him on the path, carrying a dusting cloth like a moral argument. "They won't let it rest," he said. "Who won't?" Purbright asked. "The town. They don't like a thing being simply itself." "It is a difficult burden," Purbright agreed. "Broken hinge," Mr. Morningside said bitterly. "That's what they're saying." "And what do you think?" Mr. Morningside hesitated. This was unusual. "I think," he said, "that no hinge breaks so politely." Purbright inclined his head. Inside the house, a quiet rearrangement had been taking place. A table had been moved 6 inches away from the window. A small sideboard now stood at a slightly defensive angle. When a man is embarrassed, he tends to reorganize furniture as though chairs might shoulder part of the shame. Outside, Miss Elspeth Cranch walked past with a basket that was lighter than her conscience. She saw the gate, saw it shut, and felt vaguely disappointed. The story was losing its teeth. And then, as evening settled in like a careful guest, something small and unsuitable appeared. A scrap of paper, folded with unnecessary neatness, lay in the gravel just inside the gate. It could have been there all day. It could have been placed moments ago. Purbright found it not by looking down, but by looking to the side. It contained no words, only a faint impression where words had once been. Someone had written hard, then removed the paper. A message, pressed and erased. He returned it to the gravel where it lay. Not everything wished to be rescued too quickly. Across the town, someone who had polished that latch stood at a kitchen sink and listened to the wireless without hearing a word. They had hoped a broken hinge would be enough. They had hoped the boy would be useful, but the gate, uncooperative even as a suspect, had a memory. And so did Inspector Purbright. The paper remained on the gravel through the night. No one saw it. Which was to say, several people passed the gate, noticed it, and then carefully decided not to have done so. In Flaxborough, discretion was rarely a matter of morals, and almost always one of furniture. By morning, the air had the polite tension of a drawing-room in which someone had broken a china plate, and no one wished to discover whose fault it was. The gate was shut. The latch gleamed with a faint, almost embarrassed shine. The scrap of paper had migrated slightly further from the hinge, as though attempting a private escape. Inspector Purbright returned without hurry. He did not pick up the paper at once. He allowed himself instead the small pleasure of noticing the gravel displaced beside it, and the faint, narrow mark left by the careful toe of a sensible shoe. He was crouching at exactly the angle he preferred when a voice behind him said, "You're standing in a very awkward place." He rose. Miss Elspeth Cranch stood 3 steps away, carrying a basket of scones and the sort of expression usually worn by people who had decided they must, at last, involve themselves in matters of public hygiene. "I come by here every morning," she said. "I don't like to see things looking untended." "Neither do I," said Purbright gently. She noticed the paper only when he noticed it, which was to say immediately and with a small intake of breath. "Oh," she said, "that'll be nothing." "Nothing is often folded," said Purbright. She bent, with enthusiasm arriving slightly before permission, and picked it up. "There's nothing written," she observed. "Not now," he agreed. She frowned at it as though it had committed a personal discourtesy, then folded it again and placed it neatly on top of his notebook without quite meeting his eyes. "That shouldn't be lying about," she said. "No," he said, "it doesn't seem the sort." She did not leave after that. Instead, she remained, shifting the basket from arm to arm, drawing breath in a way that indicated she had a further thought, and now that she had crossed the moral threshold of being involved, did not care to retreat. "There's been a bit of talk," she said. "There always is." "Yes, well, people are thinking all sorts of things. Poor Mr. Morningside, so proud of that gate." "He is," said Purbright. "And young Harold?" she added carefully. "It would be a shame." "It would." She looked at him suddenly with a directness that startled even herself. "I have a key," she said. Purbright did not respond too quickly. He had learned that confessions in Flaxborough were like jam, best allowed to come out of the jar by themselves. "A key?" he encouraged. "For emergency use," she said with dignity. "Mr. Morningside gave it to me years ago, in case he ever had a fall or anything of that sort. It's in a tin with my thread and needles." "How very public-spirited of you." "I've never used it," she added promptly. "Never dreamed of it?" "No," Purbright said. She waited. He waited. "I did go through the gate," she said finally. "Yesterday?" he asked. "The evening before." This was interesting. "I'd been at the church hall," she said, "and I saw it was open, just standing there." She hesitated. "It didn't seem right to leave it so." "So you closed it?" "Yes." "With your hand?" She paused. "I used the key," she said faintly. "The key that fitted the gate should not by rights have needed turning." But that was not what troubled Purbright. "What time was this?" "About 8. "And did you mention this to anyone?" "No." "That would have been very noisy," he said. "I don't like attention," she said, with a firmness that suggested she liked it very much indeed. Inside the house, Mr. Morningside moved a small table an inch closer to the wall. He did not know why he did this. He simply felt he ought to make room for some unseen pressure. Outside, Sergeant Lovegrove continued to enjoy his hinge theory to anyone who would listen. He liked the idea of mechanical failure. It did not answer back. Purbright walked back to the station slowly, weighing the key that now existed in the story. It changed the shape of things without changing their size. The gate had not simply been left, it had been touched, attended to, improved upon by someone who wished to be helpful and unseen at the same time. That afternoon, the trouble deepened. A small object was found inside Mr. Morningside's house. It was nothing of value. It was, however, nothing of his. A handkerchief, neatly folded, placed on the sideboard that had been moved an inch too far from its original position. It smelled faintly of lavender and starch and moral confidence. Mr. Morningside Holding it, as one might hold an accusation, felt something rather unusual for him. He felt nervous. Purbright, when he saw it, did not pick it up. He merely said, "Someone is trying very hard to tidy up." Elsewhere in Flaxborough, Miss Cranch sat at her kitchen table, holding her key tin open and staring into it as though it now contained something entirely new. She had said too much, not to the wrong man, but at the wrong time. And now the gate, with its hesitant latch and obedient hinge, had acquired a second mystery. Who was leaving messages that were meant to be erased? And who was tidying up afterward? By the fifth day, the town of Flaxborough had developed the particular expression it wore when it wished to appear calm while privately nourishing excitement. Curtains twitched with discipline. Conversations lowered themselves out of instinct. Respectability drew its shoulders a little tighter and assured itself that it had seen worse. The handkerchief became the newest object of interest. Mr. Morningside, who had never previously owned such a thing that was not his own, found himself placing it repeatedly back upon the sideboard, as though by moving it he might discover a version of events that better suited his digestion. It was too neat, that handkerchief. Its folds were precise in the way of someone who liked drawers to be straight and visitors to be brief. The scent of lavender and starch hung about it with quiet authority. Inspector Purbright regarded it with the mild air of a man asked to admire a relative he did not trust. "And you've no idea how it came here?" he asked gently. "None," said Mr. Morningside, a little too quickly. "And you touched nothing?" "I moved the sideboard," Mr. Morningside admitted. "It seemed wrong." "Things often do," Purbright said, "when they remember more than we do." Meanwhile, the town had adjusted its theories. The broken hinge, while still beloved by Sergeant Lovegrove, was beginning to lose public support. It was difficult to build outrage around a piece of metal when there was a handkerchief involved. Cloth was more human. Cloth suggested intention. At the baker's, Mrs. Dawlish had already determined that the whole business was a matter of appearances. "It's not theft," she said, meaning she hoped very much that it was. "It's not common dirt. It's something higher." "Higher than what?" asked Mildred Hapscombe. "Higher than shame," Mrs. Dawlish said, "which is saying something." Purbright walked slowly through the town that afternoon, observing how stories arranged themselves around people. Harold Pinter's name was still being used, but less enthusiastically now. The handkerchief had not seemed like something a chemist's assistant would carry. It was too deliberate, too domesticated. Behind him, Lovegrove continued to be hopeful. "Could be planted, sir," he said. "Try to throw us off." "Perhaps," Purbright replied, "or perhaps someone wishes very badly to be useful." The distinction troubled Lovegrove. In the quiet of Alderney House, more rearrangements occurred. Not from panic, exactly, but from a desire to place things back where they had been before they began to seem accusatory. Mr. Morningside lifted a small vase and returned it to its former, faintly remembered position. He straightened a doily that had done nothing wrong. He even polished a clock that could not remember the last time it had been on time. He felt watched. He was not wrong. From the street, a pair of eyes paused on the gate each time they passed. Miss Cranch had begun to walk more slowly, as though the path beyond Alderney House now formed part of her responsibilities. The key tin in her kitchen remained open. She could not bear to close it. Closing it felt final. Purbright returned to the station as the afternoon light softened, and the story took a small, dangerous step forward. A child carrying more honesty than tact brought him a discovery. "Found this by the hedge," the boy said, holding out something delicate between his fingers. It was another scrap of paper. This one had words, half words at least. The impression was faint but legible to the eye of a man who had learned to read intentions between lines. "Will be taken," was visible. The rest had been erased by pressure and fear. "Who gave you this?" Purbright asked. "No one," the child said proudly. "I just thought you'd like it." "That was very sensible," Purbright said. In a back room somewhere in the town, a cupboard door was opened and closed with needless energy. A small stack of papers was counted, then counted again. A woman who had spent her life keeping order among teaspoons and prayers now felt the quiet sting of disorder. She had meant only to help, she had meant only to protect, but things, once nudged, developed habits of their own. That evening, Purbright walked once more past the gate. It was shut, more than shut. It had been latched with a firmness that went beyond necessity. Someone, he thought, was beginning to panic. Across the street, a curtain fell very slightly out of line. He paused, not because he had heard anything, but because he had not. Silence had qualities he trusted. And inside Alderney House, Mr. Morningside sat with the handkerchief folded neatly beside him and felt, for the first time, that respectability might be something that could be peeled away, layer by thin layer, by nothing more violent than kindness applied at the wrong moment. The gate, in the fading light, stood obediently closed, but it did not look convinced. The tea-room on Market Street had long cultivated the appearance of innocence. Lace curtains, china cups of excessive delicacy, and a menu that never strayed beyond the moral safety of sponge cake all contributed to a sense that nothing unsavory could possibly survive within its walls. This was, of course, precisely why it was the preferred headquarters of quiet conspiracy. By mid-morning, the usual corner table had attracted its natural occupants. Mrs. Dawlish sat with the careful posture of a woman who believed she had once been wronged, but could not now remember by whom. Mildred Hapscombe, alert and softly triumphant, stirred her tea with a precision normally associated with surgical procedures. Miss Cranch arrived last, sitting slightly apart, though not quite far enough to be considered aloof. They spoke, outwardly, of scones. Inwardly, they spoke of Mr. Morningside. "I heard," Mrs. Dawlish said softly, "that things in that house have been moved." Mildred inclined her head. "People don't move their furniture without reason," she said. "Not decent people." Miss Cranch's fingers tightened around her cup. "He's had a fright," Mrs. Dawlish continued. "That's what I say. Things don't just appear in houses." "No," agreed Mildred, "not things folded." They drank, and the silence that followed was companionable, the sort only possible when everyone present felt they were in possession of superior knowledge. Inspector Purbright arrived in the tea-room without any visible form of arrival. He did not glance towards the table. He simply took a seat by the window and ordered tea and a slice of seed cake. The eyes at the corner table adjusted. There were those who spoke less loudly, and those who spoke a little more. "These things don't happen in houses like that," said Mrs. Dawlish with careful volume. Purbright buttered his cake without hurry. A waitress who had heard everything the town had to say in the last 12 years approached him. "Busy morning, sir," she said. "People are communicating," he replied. "They do," she said. "Not always to the right people." She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering as custom required. "Miss Cranch has been in here twice today." "That is a sign of trouble," Purbright said. "She's worn a hole in that poor saucer." At the corner table, Miss Cranch attempted to speak and found her voice had the irritating habit of trembling when it met responsibility. "I was only trying to be helpful," she said. No one had accused her of anything. This was, in Flaxborough, significant. After tea, the town's version of progress took another step. The vicar, who disliked scandal in much the same way he disliked drafts, called in at the police station. He sat with the careful discomfort of a man unused to chairs that did not belong to the Almighty. "It's nothing," he said. "Of course," said Purbright. "But people are saying—" "Well, I wouldn't normally repeat such things." "You are repeating them now," Purbright observed gently. "There are whispers," said the vicar, "about documents." Purbright did not move his expression. "Documents? Private ones? Anything that might wound a reputation?" "Is there any reason," Purbright asked, "that Mr. Morningside's reputation should feel tender?" The vicar coughed. "None that I know of." This was carefully true. That afternoon, Purbright walked once more to Alderney House. The latch had not been polished since morning. This in itself was unusual. The gate seemed weary. Its small rebellion had grown tiring. Inside, Mr. Morningside greeted him with the fragile dignity of a man attempting to remember how to be innocent. "People are asking things," Mr. Morningside said. "They always do," Purbright replied. "I heard something," he said, and looked ashamed of it. "About papers." "What sort of papers?" "I don't know." "Have you any?" Mr. Morningside's hand twitched. "I had some." Purbright waited. Silence had become a more reliable witness than any sergeant. "There were letters," Mr. Morningside said. "Old misunderstandings? Are they still here?" He did not answer at once. Instead, he looked at the sideboard which seemed now to be judging him. "I can't find them," he said. This was, at last, something. Outside, the afternoon softened. The gate was still, but no longer passive. It had the air of an accomplice that was beginning to wonder whether it had been wise to be involved. And elsewhere, at a kitchen table smelling faintly of lavender and starch, Miss Cranch unfolded a piece of paper she had hidden inside the lining of her key tin. It was not the scrap from the gravel. It was something else. A copy, impressed by pressure. A letter. Not words she had written. Words she had borrowed and pressed into new paper with a firmness born of desperation. She read the faint lines again. "Yale will be taken." She had thought she was protecting the town. She had thought she was protecting a man. Instead, she had created a soft, growing shape of trouble. Back in the tea room, the waitress wiped a cup and leaned toward Mildred Hapscomb. "He called it a conversation," she whispered. "Who?" Mildred asked. "The inspector?" Mildred smiled faintly. She liked the sound of that because it meant there was more to come, and in Flaxborough nothing was more nourishing than that. The discovery that Mr. Morningside's letters were missing did not announce itself to the town. It seeped into it. By the next morning, the idea was already circulating in softened phrases and cautious glances, like a draught that no one admitted feeling while everyone reached for a shawl. The second disturbance did not involve noise. It involved absence. Inspector Purbright arrived at Alderney House shortly after 9, at an hour when conscience tended to be awake and deception still a little drowsy. He found Mr. Morningside seated stiffly at the table, hands folded, eyes turned not towards the door, but towards a cupboard that stood slightly ajar. "You looked there already?" Purbright said. "Yes," said Mr. Morningside, "several times." "Cupboards," Purbright observed, "have a way of disappointing us only after they have given us hope." "I know what was in there," Mr. Morningside said faintly. "I know, because I've never looked at them. People who look at their own papers begin to remember things." "And now?" "And now they are gone." There were no signs of force, no drawers upended, no locks damaged. The robbery, if such it could be called, had been performed with the courtesy of someone tidying a writing desk. At the police station, Sergeant Lovegrove attempted to look pleased. "Now we're getting somewhere," he said. "Real business this. Papers gone. Theft." "Perhaps," said Purbright, "or perhaps embarrassment moving from one house to another." Lovegrove frowned. He disliked crimes that wandered. By midday the town had adjusted. The gate was no longer the central object. It became the beginning of a longer, more satisfying narrative. The handkerchief, the scrap of paper, and now the missing letters gathered themselves into something that felt almost like a plot. At the chemist's, Harold Pinter was quietly relieved. People were no longer watching him with the thoughtful eyes reserved for criminals and interesting pets. He returned to becoming invisible, which was his natural and preferred state. In the tea-room, speculation deepened. "Letters," Mrs. Dawlish said, as though tasting something disagreeable. "Old letters are always trouble." "Especially the sort that belong to respectable gentlemen," Mildred added. Miss Cranch said nothing. Her tea cooled untouched. She had felt a tightening in her chest since early morning, and it had nothing to do with draughts. At Alderney House, Purbright examined the open cupboard with professional mildness. The shelves were clean, dustless, scrubbed not long ago by hands that could not bear the thought of untidiness. "Did anyone have reason to tidy this?" he asked. "No," said Mr. Morningside. "Yes," he added after a pause. "That is a useful distinction," Purbright murmured. "They were upsetting things," Mr. Morningside said. "Letters about foolishness." "Your foolishness?" Purbright asked without cruelty. "Yes." "Or someone else's?" Mr. Morningside did not answer. That afternoon brought the second, quieter shock. A small envelope appeared on Purbright's desk at the station without any accompanying knock, announcement, or apology. It lay there with the confident innocence of something that wished to be found. It was addressed to no one. Inside it were no letters, only faint impressions, words pressed so hard into paper that their ghosts remained after the originals had gone. Purbright held it to the light. "Will be taken," he read again. But now there were more. "For your own good." The faint trail of gratitude, the clumsy shape of kindness. "This," Purbright said softly to himself, "is not a thief's work." Outside, in a small, careful house that smelt of boiled potatoes and moral vigilance, Miss Cranch tidied her table again and again. She moved her sugar bowl 3 times. She aligned her teaspoons as though they might offer guidance. She had not taken the letters. Not exactly. She had removed them in the way one might remove a dangerous ornament from a child's reach. They now lay folded in paper and hiding in the back of her linen cupboard, among things that smelt of lavender and duty. She told herself she had saved him. She told herself she had saved the town. That evening the gate was found open again. Not wide, not flagrantly. Just an inch. The sort of opening that suggested intention rather than accident. Mildred Hapscombe gasped aloud from behind her curtains. "Again," she said. By nightfall the councillors convinced themselves that things were getting worse. Councillor Bottle suggested patrols. This caused no end of satisfaction, and was, fortunately, ignored. Purbright returned to the gate alone. He placed one finger against the wood and felt the small tremor left by recent handling. A careful hand, a reluctant conscience. Someone had come and gone without violence. Someone who had a purpose that felt, in their own mind, decent. He did not close the gate. He left it exactly as he found it. Inside Alderney House, Mr. Morningside sat in his chair and stared at the cupboard. He did not feel angry. He felt curiously grateful. The letters had frightened him more than he had allowed himself to believe. This, too, troubled him. Across the road, a curtain remained slightly out of line. Behind it, a woman told herself that she had done a good thing, and behind her own certainty, a thin, persistent fear began to stretch and yawn like a gate that refused to shut. By the 8th day, Flaxborough had achieved the quiet hum of collective unease. It was the sort of atmosphere that looked, from the outside, like calm, but from within felt like a drawing room in which too many people were sitting on chairs with secrets tucked beneath them. The open gate was no longer discussed aloud with surprise. It had become accepted, which in respectable towns is a far more dangerous development. Things that are accepted are rarely examined. Inspector Purbright walked slowly through the market square, noticing how the same people stood in slightly altered positions, how stalls were arranged with more care than necessary, how glances lingered on doorways that had previously been unremarkable. Everyone had adjusted, but no one had confessed to it. Respectability, he reflected, had a taste. It was faintly bitter, faintly sweet, and always left a coating behind. At Alderney House, Mr. Morningside had begun to eat less. It was not that he had lost his appetite, rather he felt less certain he deserved it. When a man's reputation becomes a subject of air rather than fact, digestion tends to suffer. "The silence is worse," he said, when Purbright visited him that afternoon. "Silence is rarely as peaceful as it appears," Purbright replied. "They're not calling," Mr. Morningside said. "Not openly." "No." "They're thinking?" "Yes." Mr. Morningside looked toward the gate, visible through the lace curtain like a polite accusation. "They think I've been careless. They think many things. They think," said Mr. Morningside, "that I have secrets I should not have." Purbright said nothing. He had learned that when a man approached the truth, it was better not to distract him with agreement. In the kitchen of a house that smelt permanently of starch and lavender, Miss Cranch folded and unfolded a towel that did not require folding. She had not slept well. Her conscience, once a tidy little room, now behaved like a corridor with draughts at both ends. She opened her linen cupboard for the 3rd time that morning. The letters lay where she had placed them, neatly stacked, tied with a ribbon that had once belonged to an Easter bonnet. She ran her fingers over them and felt neither triumph nor relief. Only the odd dry taste of having done something which could not be undone. They had not been scandalous letters in the way that novels would have them. They were weary letters. Letters of disappointment and poor judgment. Letters in which Mr. Morningside had once complained, quietly and cautiously, about a business arrangement that had turned sour and a person who had behaved with less than saintly constraint. They had not been dangerous, they were simply unbecoming. That, in Flaxborough, was quite enough. At the tea-room, the usual corner table continued to perform its civil duty. "I wouldn't like it," said Mrs. Dawlish, "if people were to look through my things." "You haven't any things," Mildred said gently. "I mean in principle," Mrs. Dawlish amended. Miss Cranch sat very straight. "I think," she said, surprising herself with the firmness of it, "that people deserve to be protected from their own pasts." There was a pause. This was not considered an entirely safe thing to say. Purbright, seated near the window once more, heard it without appearing to. He added sugar to his tea in the slow, deliberate way of a man who has learned that the smallest movements are often the most revealing. Outside, the gate stood closed and for a time behaved itself, but respectability, once disturbed, has the irritating habit of continuing. That evening, Sergeant Lovegrove brought to Purbright's office something which changed the angle of everything without changing its size. "Sir," he said, holding out a small object on a handkerchief of his own, "found this by the hedge just near Alderney House." It was a key. Not the key, a copy. Cruder, newer. Heavy, Lovegrove added unnecessarily. Purbright lifted it and felt the weight settle into his fingers. "A new key," he said. "Looks like it." "A key," Purbright said softly, "made by someone who didn't expect to be thanked for it." Outside, the evening drew the town into itself. Doors shut with quiet insistence. Curtains aligned themselves as though preparing for inspection. In her kitchen, Miss Cranch noticed, with a small tightening of breath, that the tin containing her original key was no longer where she had left it. She found it in the pantry, which she had not visited since Tuesday. She did not remember putting it there. Memory, she reflected, had become inconvenient. Mr. Morningside, meanwhile, sat at his desk and attempted to remember the last time he had been truly foolish. He found he could remember several. He also found that they were not as dramatic as he had feared, merely small compromises and polite evasions, which had not seemed important until now. When a thing has taste, Purbright thought, walking back through the dusk, someone has tried it. The copy of the key suggested a mind that liked preparation, not theft, not cruelty, preparation. It suggested a desire to have things under control while appearing not to have touched them. At the gate, he paused. The latch had not been polished. The wood had not been touched. This, too, was a message. Someone was learning. Across the road, a curtain moved and then stilled. Behind it, Miss Cranch watched the dark settle and thought with a small flash of indignation that no one appreciated kindness once it began to have consequences. She had wanted only to tidy the past. She had wanted only to keep things from becoming unsightly. But respectability, once interfered with, developed a preference for resistance. Purbright stood in the street for a long moment, listening not to sounds but to habits. He could hear, in the small quiets between footsteps and whispers, the shape of what had not yet been said. Someone had made a key. Someone had taken letters. Someone had left gates open not to enter, but to release. The town, tasting its own unease, closed its mouth and smiled more carefully. And Inspector Purbright, adjusting his hat as he turned for home, felt the polite beginnings of certainty, though he had no intention yet of sharing it. The morning arrived in Flaxborough with an air of careful rehearsal. People behaved as though they had been given invisible lines to follow and were determined not to forget them. Doors were opened with deliberation, greetings exchanged with a shade more courtesy than usual, and eyes lingered just long enough on familiar faces to suggest that familiarity had developed new edges. Inspector Purbright decided that it was time to move the story forward without appearing to touch it. He began, as he often did, with tea. The tea-room on Market Street was its usual self, lace, politeness, and a kind of peaceful tension that settled into the upholstery. Purbright chose a table not by the window, but slightly behind it, placing himself where he could be seen without seeming to watch. He did not summon anyone, he merely waited. The first ripple came from Mrs. Dawlish, who lowered herself into her habitual chair and announced loudly to no one in particular, "Well, they say it's all becoming clearer now." Mildred Hapscombe, sharpening her attention like a pencil, asked, "Who says?" "Oh, people," Mrs. Dawlish replied, meaning that she herself had said it twice that morning. Miss Cranch arrived a little later than usual. She carried her basket, but set it down without opening it, which in Flaxborough was the equivalent of leaving one's hat on in church. Purbright waited for the silence to do its work. At last Miss Cranch spoke, to the table, the air, and perhaps her own reflection in the teapot. "I do hope," she said, "that people aren't thinking badly of anyone who meant well." This was not addressed to him. That was what made it interesting. Afterward, he walked not to Alderney House, but past it. He passed it once, then again, then a third time, allowing himself to be counted by the curtains. The gate remained shut, but it now carried the air of a thing that expected to be tested. By afternoon, Purbright had arranged his test, not with authority, not with threat, but with politeness. He asked Sergeant Lovegrove to mention, casually, at the post office and the butcher's, and to anyone who would pretend not to listen, that the police had great hopes of finding the missing letters because a new key had been located, and that new keys were always made by people who had nothing to hide. "This is untrue," Lovegrove said. "Yes," Purbright agreed. "That is why it is useful." By evening, the rumour had reached the ears it was intended for. In Miss Cranch's house the air became heavier. The walls, which had once been companions, began to feel slightly accusatory. She opened the pantry door and found the tin with the key inside it, now placed neatly on the middle shelf, as though the house itself had repositioned it. She did not remember touching it. She did, however, remember the new key, the crude one. She had not thought it would be noticed. She had thought it was clever. She told herself she was clever. But cleverness, she was beginning to realize, was a younger person's game. Purbright returned to Alderney House that evening, not to inspect, but to speak. Mr. Morningside greeted him with an expression that tried to pass for calm and failed politely. "They say you've found something," Mr. Morningside said. "They say many things," Purbright replied. "I heard about a key." "Yes." "A copy?" "Yes." Mr. Morningside sat down heavily. "I don't understand why anyone would—" he began. "Sometimes," Purbright said, "people don't act to harm, they act to arrange." Mr. Morningside frowned. "I don't like people arranging my life." "No." "You think—" Purbright did not answer directly. Instead, he looked again at the furniture that no longer quite matched its memory. "At what time?" he asked. "Do you usually check the gate?" "Every night, 9:30. "And if it were open?" "I should close it." "And if it had been opened from the inside?" Mr. Morningside hesitated. "I would— Suppose I had forgotten." This, Purbright thought, was as close to confession as respectable men tended to come. The true setting of the trap came the following morning. Purbright walked deliberately to the gate and very deliberately left it open, not wide, not obvious, but openly enough that no one passing could fail to see it unless they wished to. He then walked to the tea-room and sat where the gate was reflected faintly in the glass of the cake-stand. He ordered tea. He waited. It did not take long. Miss Cranch passed. She slowed. She stopped. She looked at the gate, and the polite shell she had built around herself cracked, very slightly, at the edges. She did not touch it. She walked on, then she turned back. Inside her, the habits of a lifetime rose like stiffly starched collars. Gates were not left open, things were not left undone. Respectability had rules, and she had followed them faithfully for 40 years. She walked up the path. She placed one careful hand on the gate. Purbright lifted his cup. He did not stand. He did not hurry. He merely watched her reflection. She tried to close the gate. It resisted. She frowned. She reached into her handbag. Her hand came out empty. She opened it again. The key tin was not there. Her breath caught. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough. Purbright stood. He crossed the street with the unhurried steps of a man walking to a meeting he had arranged. "Good morning, Miss Cranch," he said. She withdrew her hand from the gate as though it had become suddenly indecent. "Good morning," she replied, too quickly. "Lovely day," he said. "Very," she said. He placed his hand gently on the gate. "It sometimes helps," he said, "if one leaves things exactly as they are." It was not an accusation. It was not yet anything. She stiffened. "I only meant—" she began. "I know," he said softly. "You meant well." Something passed across her face that might, in other circumstances, have been called relief. "Would you care to sit down?" he asked. "Perhaps have some tea? We could talk about keys." Her lips thinned. The trap did not close, but it had been set, and she had walked straight into the first wire. Across the street, a curtain moved again. Inside, Mr. Morningside watched, without knowing exactly what he was watching, and felt a curious mixture of dread and gratitude. And Inspector Purbright, walking back towards the tea-room with Miss Cranch beside him, felt the small, inward satisfaction of a mechanism beginning, at last, to turn. They sat at a small table in the tea-room that had recently known more secrets than sugar. Miss Cranch placed her handbag on her lap and held it there as though it were a living creature that might decide to betray her if loosened. Inspector Purbright stirred his tea without sugar, milk, or haste, allowing the silence to settle into its proper shape before disturbing it. Outside, the open gate remained unattended, like a thought left deliberately unfinished. "I suppose," Miss Cranch said at last, "that I shouldn't be surprised to be here?" "No," Purbright agreed, "you shouldn't." She gave a short, humourless laugh. "I only ever meant to make things better." "Of course," he said. "That is what troubles towns most of all." He did not produce handcuffs. He did not raise his voice. He did not say the word confession. Instead, he said, "Tell me about the letters." She stiffened at once, as though the word itself had been ironed flat. "I didn't read them," she said quickly, on dumb. "I know." "I folded them." "Yes." "I tied them." "Yes." Her hands moved unconsciously, miming each remembered action. "I couldn't let them be there," she said. "Not where anyone might catch sight of them. People leave curtains open, cupboards half shut. They forget themselves." "And you remembered them," Purbright said. "Someone had to." She leaned forward slightly. "He's not a bad man. I don't believe he is. He just didn't know how to draw a tidy line under things. Few people do." In the house across the road, Mr. Morningside sat with his hands folded in his lap, observing nothing in particular and everything at once. He had seen Miss Cranch walk with the inspector. He had seen them disappear through the tea-room door. He had told himself with steady sincerity that it was probably about the hinges. He did not believe it. Back in the tea-room, Purbright continued as though discussing a matter of gardening. "You made a copy of the key?" he said. She nodded. "I didn't trust myself to put it back properly every time." "You were afraid of being caught with it?" "Yes." "So you made another?" "Yes." "And you practiced?" "Yes." "And you left the original in odd places?" "I might have." "So that you could pretend you'd mislaid it?" She closed her eyes briefly. "I must have been very foolish." "Not foolish," Purbright said, determined. He let the word settle. "And the scrap of paper," he added quietly. She opened her eyes. "I pressed the words," she said, "onto fresh paper so that I could see them without looking at them." "Why?" "So I could convince myself they were worse than they were." He inclined his head. "That is a very human thing to do." She folded her hands inside her bag. "I opened the gate," she said. "The first night, I mean. Just to go in. I thought I heard something. And the rest of the times, I wanted it to look like someone else had done it." She looked at him then, and there was no longer any attempt at disguise. "I thought if people believed there was danger, they would stop looking so closely at decent people, at old friends, at themselves." "And instead?" Purbright asked. "And instead," she said, "they looked harder." He nodded. "There is something else," he said. She went very still. "You placed the handkerchief?" "Yes." "Why?" "It looked better inside a house that had been unsettled," she said. "It gave the disturbance a shape." "So it wouldn't look chaotic?" "Yes." Silence returned, but now it was different. It was no longer protective. It was honest. They paid for their tea like any other customers. On the walk back to Alderney House, Purbright said nothing about arrest. He said nothing about court. He spoke only of ordinary things. "Do you like gardening?" he asked. "I never liked climbing roses," she said. "They have a way of remembering where they hurt you." "Yes." They stopped at the gate. It was still open. Miss Cranch looked at it. She did not touch it. Inside the house, Mr. Morningside heard footsteps and held his breath without knowing why. Purbright stepped forward and placed his hand on the wood. "If you don't mind," he said, "I think we'll shut this." He closed it carefully. Not firmly, not finally. Just enough. Inside, the latch fell with a small click that sounded less like a lock and more like an agreement. Mr. Morningside came to the door and paused. He saw Purbright. He saw Miss Cranch. He understood nothing. He understood everything. "I'm sorry," she said before anyone could stop her. He did not know what he accepted, but he nodded. Later, alone in his office, Purbright wrote a report that never once used the word crime. It used words like misjudgment, tidiness, and excess of consideration. Sergeant Lovegrove didn't like it. "Makes it sound like no one did anything wrong," he said. "Someone did," Purbright replied. "But they did it because they cared how things looked." That evening, the gate remained shut. For once, no one touched it. Mildred Hapscombe noticed and felt mildly cheated. Mrs. Dawlish suspected that something had been decided somewhere and was not pleased to have been excluded. The tea-room returned to scones. And in a small house smelling of lavender, Miss Cranch sat at her table and opened the key tin. Inside, for the first time in days, the key lay quietly where she had put it. And Inspector Purbright, adjusting his papers, felt the small, sober satisfaction of a garden that had been put back in its proper shape. Not trimmed, not corrected, simply allowed to rest. The following morning in Flaxborough arrived with the careful discretion of a person entering a room after an argument and pretending not to notice the overturned chair. Windows were opened, beds were made, kettles were set on the hob, and life arranged itself back into the familiar shape of decency. Nothing outwardly had changed. This, of course, was untrue. At Alderney House, Mr. Morningside stood at his front window a little longer than usual, watching a sparrow conduct a useless but spirited argument with a hedge. The gate was shut. The latch sat in its place with modest dignity. He felt, for the first time in several days, that he did not need to check it. He did not think of Miss Cranch as a criminal. He thought of her as a woman who had once straightened his curtains when he had been away overnight, and who had never quite stopped arranging things. The letters, now returned and replaced in their proper drawer, lay untouched. He did not intend to read them again. They felt less dangerous now, less like accusations and more like bones from a healed fracture. Across the road, Mildred Hapscombe felt a faint disappointment. Nothing had happened. Nothing, that is, that she could see. She had watched the tea-room. She had noted the absence of raised voices. She had recorded the lack of policemen's boots passing at speed. It was unsatisfying. Towns, she reflected, had a way of tidying up their excitements too soon. Mrs. Dawlish, at the baker's, whispered to no one in particular. "Well, they say it's all been smoothed over." Nobody asked who had smoothed it. Nobody asked how. People returned to speaking about weather. At the station, Sergeant Lovegrove read the final portion of Purbright's report with visible unease. "You've written," he said, tapping the paper, "that it was an excess of public-mindedness combined with private anxiety." "Yes," said Purbright. "That doesn't sound like a crime." "I didn't say it was." Lovegrove frowned. "What does it sound like?" "It sounds," Purbright replied, "like Flaxborough." He went out later than usual that day, walking a slow circuit of the streets, taking note of the ways in which habits reassembled themselves after disturbance. Children resumed chalking invisible hopscotch lines. Dogs resumed their modest, suspicious patrols. The postman resumed his habit of peering thoughtfully at hedges. He passed the tea-room. Through the window he saw Miss Cranch sitting alone. She was not crying. She was not trembling. She was stirring her tea and not drinking it. This struck him as a sign of progress. When she looked up and saw him, she gave a small, uncertain nod. He returned it with the kind of courtesy usually reserved for people who had once tried, in their own misguided way, to keep the world in order. She did not rise. He did not enter. That would have been too much like drawing a line under something that was not yet ready to be closed. At Alderney House, the afternoon light fell across the gate in a way that made it look almost beautiful. It had a faint scar where too many careful hands had tested it, polished it, judged it. But it stood, firm and obedient, accepting at last that it could neither control nor correct the town. Inspector Purbright paused there for a moment, not as an officer of the law, but as a man interested in how things chose to behave when they were no longer being watched. He did not touch the latch, he did not test the hinge, he simply observed the way the shadow of the gate lay quiet across the gravel, like a thing at rest. Inside a small house, Miss Cranch returned from the tea-room and placed her key tin in its proper drawer. She did not open it. She did not move it from side to side. She left it alone, which was perhaps the bravest action of her life. In the privacy of her kitchen, she allowed herself the thought that perhaps the town would survive without constant adjustment. Perhaps things could be allowed to appear imperfect and still be acceptable. That night, Flaxborough slept with the gentle exhaustion of a place that had been mildly shaken and decided, collectively, to ignore the tremor. Windows were dark, curtains were drawn, gates were closed. Someone, somewhere, did not check, and nothing happened. The next morning, Purbright returned to his desk, to paperwork that involved parking disputes and a missing wheelbarrow. He sharpened 2 pencils. He aligned 3 papers that had no intention of misbehaving. He drank tea that tasted faintly of leaves and faintly of conclusion. He did not think of the affair as solved. He thought of it as absorbed. Things in Flaxborough were not ended. They were incorporated, politely, into the fabric of routine. When he walked home that evening, he heard a faint click behind him. He turned. The gate was still shut. Of course it was. Somewhere in the sitting room, Mildred Hapscombe rearranged a cushion and assured herself that nothing important had been missed. Somewhere else, Mrs. Dawlish convinced herself she had been right all along. Somewhere else still, Mr. Morningside locked his front door and felt, without quite knowing why, relieved. And Inspector Purbright, pausing at the corner before disappearing from the street, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Not because justice had been done, but because things had been put back into their natural, slightly crooked order. The garden slept, the latch held, the town resumed its breathing, quiet and steady. And no one, for a very long moment, felt the need to open anything at all.